Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the next topic in economic development, which is the diversity among developing nations. The preceding video had to do with common characteristics of developing nations, but of course, all developing nations have their own different makeup of resources, historical background, there are geographic factors, there are ethnic and religious factors that play in, the structure of the industry, political structure, all of these things make up I think of them as ingredients into making this beautiful thing that each country in the world really is. So let's take a closer look. So here they are. There are, how many are there? 7 of them, right? There's the resource endowment, the way in which that can be different between developing nations. Of course, the historical background, the geographic and demographic factors, ethnic and religious breakdown, the structure of industry, per capita income levels, and the political structure. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Really what you probably need to do is go back to your course companion and get more information on this in order to have a full understanding. But it's useful just to have some information thrown at you at what each one of these things might mean. Okay, so first off, right, resource endowment, what does that mean? Well, it means what sorts of natural resources the particular country have, right? And there's a tendency to assume that developing countries must be poorly endowed with resources, both physical and human, but that's not necessarily the case. Right, some of the poorest countries in the world actually have enormous amount of natural resources. Angola and oil is an example. Nigeria and oil is an example. Bangladesh, on the other hand, is poorly endowed with physical resources, but it does have ability maybe to do something else, right? So it should be remembered that a lack of physical resources does not necessarily mean that a country cannot be successful. Jocelyn Blinks brings up Japan and Singapore as a great examples. Like, they basically have no natural resources, but they're able to develop. Okay, so the different ingredient things that are in that country contribute a lot to the overall outcome of the country. All right. The second thing is historical background. A large portion of the developing countries were once colonies, and that's true, right? But the extent to which this has affected those countries varies greatly, and much of it depends on the length of time that the countries were colonized, or whether or not the colonizer traded freely with them. Right? It could be argued that some countries gained more positive outcomes as a result of this, and some of them didn't. Right? Well, colonized or not, there's no doubt that whatever developing countries we consider, there will be big differences in historical differences that will set the countries apart socially, politically, and economically. All right. The third thing is geographic and demographic factors. This is sort of obvious, right? Developing countries differ hugely in terms of their size, their population, what makes them up. And it's a common mistake, though, to assume that all developing countries have large populations, which isn't true, right? We think of China and Japan and maybe Indonesia, but there are others that are quite small that are sort of equally undeveloped, I should say, right? So that's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but it's true. All right, number 4, ethnic and religious breakdown. This is critical. Internal religious differences can have a dramatic impact on the overall trajectory of a nation. And of course, the ethnic backgrounds too. And where this really shows itself the worst is in Africa, because many of the country lines that are drawn up that divide countries in Africa were done by European powers. And so as a result, you have people that are on two sides of a particular border. Cameroon and Nigeria is a good example, that were historically the same people. Now they divided arbitrarily into 2 different countries, Nigeria and Cameroon, which is the decision that the French and the British made. So these sorts of things can really, really play a large role in how countries interact with one another. Right? The other thing is, like, if you have a pretty homogenous society, they have same religious background, same ethnic background, there's going to be a different type of skill set maybe that's going to be involved in its development. Okay, number 5, the structure of industry. It's widely assumed that all developing countries depend upon the production of and exportation of primary products. And while this might be true, and we could have examples, say, of Ethiopia and Angola, which produce primary products, there are other places like Bangladesh, Nepal, that are actually exports of manufactured goods, and that has a lot to do with their histories, right? And there are other places, the Dominican Republic's a good example, that what do they export? They export their beautiful country in terms of tourism. So the sources of the structure of industry is important to take into consideration when you talk about the diversity among developing nations. Okay, the 6th thing to take into account is the per capita income levels. And although it's often thought that all developing countries have very low levels of per capita income, we should be aware that there are many differences in the per capita income from developing country to developing country. And so, maybe take a look at a chart somewhere in our course companion. There's one right on page 340 that'll help you, but that's not always the case. There's not always a connection between the level of development and per capita income in a particular country. And the last thing is political structure, and I think maybe, at least in historic sense, maybe this is like the most significant, because developing countries have varying political structures. They could be democracies, they could be monarchies, they could have come out of military rule, they could be single-party states like Cuba and Syria and China, they could be theocracies like Iran, or they could be in some sort of transition, right, where there's political systems have been tried and tried, but because of the uncertainty and the volatility of the political scene, nothing's really like worked or has endured. So Haiti and Somalia might be an example of that. But these different political structures, of course, play a very important role in the way in which that they can function in the international community. And you got to remember that it could be a presidential system, it could be a parliamentary system, and all of these things play into who they would be friends with or how they would be viewed by the external world. So while there are some common characteristics that are held by developing countries to a certain degree, there's some many differences, and you got to be careful about making generalizations in all of these regards, because you can really get yourself into a really opinionated, uninformed, maybe even disrespectful evaluation and analysis in this section on development. Okay, so there you go. I hope this video was helpful. We'll talk to you in a bit.